And I just wanted to welcome everybody to today's ASCILITE live webinar, Creating Trust and Learning Community Relationships in Online Learning. Our featured presenter today is Petrea Redmond from University of Southern Queensland. And Petrea is going to talk a bit about how, when we move into this next session, where we haven't had those opportunities to meet with students face-to-face first, how do we begin to build those relationships, trust, and that sense of community? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Petrea.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for the invitation to join today, David. As we said before, we're happy for questions at the end of every slide, or you can pop them in the chat session as we go along. Today I would like to talk about community and trust and learning communities, as David said. And we need to all recognise that COVID has actually made a very significant impact globally, not just on education, but the way that we are living, the way that we're learning, the way that we're teaching, and it's quite dynamic and different than what most people have experienced previously. And in the transition from the traditional face-to-face teaching to online teaching, for some, it's an exciting, inspirational, fun and unplanned experience, and others it's been very confusing, very stressful, very technical, and there's a perception actually that there will be a lower quality of learning and teaching occurring in this line. I've been, I'm not sure if lucky is the word, but fortunate enough to work at a university that has the majority of their students always learn online. So 70% of their students learn online, and I've been teaching online since the mid-2000s or early 2000s probably. I teach in a teacher education context, also STEM education, and in the Masters of Education along with doctoral students. And you'll probably find that your university might be using a different name for whatever's happening now or next. So it could be online or e-learning or hybrid learning or blended learning or remote learning or emergency learning, whatever it is. I think we need to recognise that the term online education is really just a big umbrella for lots of different practices that happen online. And we know that if teaching and learning online is planned and well designed and well facilitated, there's no significant difference in the learning outcomes for students. However, that wasn't the case for most of us. Educational institutions had to move very quickly rather than strategically to put things online. And if you read the research around online education, the concepts of online presence, student engagement, community and connectedness, they're critical factors for student retention and student success. So by presence, I mean that you as the instructor, you're visible or can be seen, or at least there's an impression that you're close at hand and available within your virtual classroom or by email or by phone. You've got to turn up and you've got to be responsive to your students' questions and comments, whether that be in real time through synchronous sessions or asynchronous mode like email and forums. And there was a previous ASCILITE webinar that discussed presence in more depth, particularly in the relationship between practice-based classes such as music, so you might want to check out the webinar recording for that. By the term engagement, I really mean that it's the interconnectedness between cognitive issues, sociocultural areas, affective areas, behavioural, organisational factors, and what does the student do or not do in that situation. And there's a lot of literature around engagement, and myself included have published in that space. So if you do a quick Google search for Redmond and online engagement, you'll see a framework paper that a number of colleagues and I put together, which looks at 5 different elements of online engagement, and they are social engagement, cognitive engagement, behavioural engagement, collaborative engagement, and emotional engagement. But in particular today, I'd like to talk about developing trust and community and connectedness, particularly where we are moving online right from the beginning of the semester. And we might not be moving online for the whole semester. We might not be moving just online. It could be some sort of blended or hybrid mode. But how do you go to develop trust in this space? For most people, there is a huge continuum of practice, so a huge lot of learning that has to happen as you move from face-to-face to online learning. And, you know, you're negotiating new spaces, new contexts, new technology, and there are pedagogical implications to that. So as you reconceptualize what learning in your discipline looks like online, you also need to consider what can you do to enhance their students' experience in the online space. And we have a diversity of stakeholders. I'm not sure about your university, but ours, there's a lot of people who talk about what makes great education. And the big tip is there is no tip. There's no single technology or strategy or resource that can possibly have the same effect on every student equally. There's no one size fits all. There is discipline differences, and there's a diversity of individuals that you have in your courses. So as you're moving online, most people start with worrying about just getting stuff online. So it becomes a place to store the resources. It becomes a place to worry about how do I use the technology. And most people should have resolved those issues, given that most people have been teaching online now for a while. The next thing people usually think about is, how am I going to manage myself and my students in this online space? So the third thing people usually worry about is the pedagogy, and sadly the last thing is usually the relationships, but that's because they're just trying to manage the day-to-day stuff. So that order is not necessarily a great order or a correct order, but it's the way to cope order for most people. And you'll all be in different stages in your transition, so I apologise if I'm going to tell any of you to suck eggs in this space, but normally, you know, you've uploaded resources and you've got some stuff there that they can work through independently or collectively. Hopefully you've added other technologies such as quizzes and videos and that sort of thing, and now that you're thinking about the start of next semester, you're thinking about the pedagogical approach, or what pedagogical theories do you aspire to, and what does that look like online? How is that different to what you're used to doing? And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that it's okay not to get it right in the one go. There are going to be errors. It is a continuum of practice, and there are moving expectations within your university based on policy and procedures and guidelines that have probably been set out, also from the students based on their experiences last semester. Both you and yourself are experiencing some eco shock. You've moved to a new environment. It's a different culture. There are different expectations, and it impacts on your confidence, both for learning and, in your case, your teaching, and also your confidence in how you might use technology. And I read a recent article. It was based in schools in Australia, and they highlighted some of the divides that moving online quickly has revealed. And these divides have always been around. They're not new, but they've really been highlighted and come to the forefront in the last few months. So there's the material guide, which is the gaps in the basic resources that student needs to support online learning. I'm not sure about your university, but our university has provided devices, laptops, etc. to students so they can actually continue their learning. There's the digital divide, so not only is that the technology, resources and devices, but it's the robustness of the internet. You know, how good is your internet? And if you have your whole family learning from home, how does that impact on your internet access? And also we have students who are used to using technology to communicate with each other, and it also to play, so for gaming and what have you, but not necessarily for learning. So that divide, digital divide, is about learning online as well. Also the skills and dispositions advised, so everybody's not equally equipped to learn online, and some people who struggle, particularly with time management and motivation, do struggle to be successful online. The instructor and peer support divide, so sometimes as instructors, not only are your students not prepared, but you're not really prepared, and the peer support is reduced because not all of the peers are also prepared to manage or cope without face-to-face contact. And the final one is the adjustments divide. And I'm not sure about your university, but our university are finalising grades for release this week. So the pedagogical adjustments and the assessments adjustments that occurred in that really short pace of time sometimes were not suitable for online learning arrangements. I think the other tip is, remember, you need to choose some tools that are actually mobile friendly, and also things that can be used offline or unplugged, so that the access to the technology itself does not become an inhibitor for learning. Are there any questions, David?
None so far.
Okay, thanks. Remember, pop your comments or questions in and David will stop me and we'll talk about them as we go through. So developing trust in a learning community, and some people would suggest, depending on the discipline, that learning does not happen in community in their space. And for me, I strongly believe that people and relationships do count a lot for learning. And in particular, at the beginning of the semester, when you're trying to create bonding, sense of belonging, relate trust, etc. That whole community development happens right at the beginning of the semester. And you didn't have to develop that community face-to-face last semester, but you will need to this semester. And of course, some of the comments that I'm making are based on the semesters of the Australian academic year, which are a little different, of course, to North America. And what I mean by, a community or a learning community is there is a shared goal. All of the members are there for the same reason, and there's, that's to learn whatever the subject is or the unit is that you're teaching. It also assumes that there's pedagogical leadership, so you are providing leadership in that space. There's purposeful and well-designed curriculum plans and structures, and that people are learning with and from each other. And that's the biggest thing that I find exciting about teaching online, is that it's not bidirectional. It's not really about the teacher to student individually or collectively, that students can learn with and from each other, and I can learn with and from my students. And that's particularly important at the postgrad level. There's also consideration as to the ability of people in the community to actually project themselves, both socially and emotionally, as real people, so they're not seen as a number or a line or what have you. So in some learning management systems, the addition of photos and what have you are useful for people to realise that we are a real community and group. And I think too that when we communicate with each other, particularly if it's first year students who may never have met each other, it's often difficult to develop that sense of trust and to be a real person or a human, or to share personal perspectives and experiences, is part of that development. So these social relationships are actually really important because they lead to cognitive relationships, which is what we're really after. And we need to remember, if a lot of the work you're doing is text-based, so you've got a lot of forums and they're asynchronous, it's much harder to do that development of trust. And for some people, when they can't see the other person, they don't really want to reveal much about themselves, and they have a feeling of alienation or loneliness in that space, or sometimes it's just indifference. So the presence and trust is required to break down the barriers and increase their willingness to actually share experience and to contribute to robust discussion and critique the contributions of others and ask probing questions, or to disagree respectfully. And the Canadians talk about pathological politeness, where everybody agrees with each other very politely and you don't get robust and cool discussion happening in your space. So think about how you can challenge people intellectually and yet respectfully critique dialogue and collaborative share meaning and develop meaning together. So you've got some sort of shared meaning and you've got some sort of shared way of knowing. So that trust development is with their peers, but also with the teaching team in that space. So trust with your instructors looks different. How often are you available, and how are you communicating with students via synchronous or asynchronous phone, email, video conference, forums, carrier pigeon? I don't know. What is it that you're using to communicate with your students? Whatever it is, that needs to be regular. You need to be regular and meaningfully in contact with them. And in this day and age, the contact often needs to be about their well-being versus their learning, because if we don't get that well-being right first, they're not going to learn anyway. I use a lot of different ways to check in. I check in via groups, or I check in individually. If I've noticed people haven't been on the learning management system at the end of week 1, I'll send them an email and go, are you okay? Is there anything you need? And I do the same at the end of week 2 and the same at the end of week 3. And I used to do that in my face-to-face classes too. I just check in and make sure they're okay. Is something happening in their life that's stopping them from attending in some way? And I also have, weekly check-in with everybody. Here's a bit of a wrap-up about what we talked about this week, and this is what you need to, do for next week before we meet again. Lots of people use social forums. I add social forums, but I actually don't participate in them, and I let my students know that. It's there for student-to-student interaction. Lots of people have things like coffee and chat sessions or Friday drink sessions in the afternoon. So whatever it is that you're going to do to create this community feeling. And there are hundreds and hundreds of books and websites that will provide icebreakers that you can use to try and develop this. So some people just get them to share a short biography about them and, find and interact with other people with the same or similar interests or in a similar location. The advantage for most people where there's a lot of face-to-face interaction, that often they're geographically close to each other, so they can still create study groups even if they are studying online. I've also found that shared experiences are useful. So if we're all reading the same thing, whether that be either fiction or non-fiction, to work in that space. I've used, tell me 3 truths and a lie, and what we've all got to do is work out what the lie is. Take a photo of where you study from right now, which could be the deck or your bedroom window or the kitchen table, or it could be in a formal study. The other issue is about routine and structure, and for them to know when you're going to be available. Are you going to have some set office hours where they can contact you and they know you're going to be there? One of my colleagues does, what are you grateful for this week? So some people might suggest more time with the family or time in the garden, or I've learned a new instrument, or I've reconnected with things. And there is also my research has shown that particularly in online forums, there is a huge discipline differences between the humanities and social sciences, who normally post quite long posts. They're very social, they're quite supportive, where the STEM students are more likely to have shorter posts, they're to the point, they're most likely to ask and answer questions, and that's kind of the things in that space. David, I saw a few things flick through.
So we've had a few questions, and I think you've sort of touched on some of them. So the first one is from Vicky, who asks, what types of activities do you include in the early weeks to help develop community?
So I did share some of those. Vicky, did you have, or does anybody else who's in the group actually have any other ideas that they would like to share as well?
Hi Petrea, it's Vicky here. I just wanted to ask, are you using what sort of online discussion forums or that, and how you're promoting engagement in those? So that's what I was interested in terms of the types of activities in with online discussion forums.
Yeah. The big tip is never just put a forum up and leave it blank. You need a call of action. You need for them to do something. So whether they are taking a photo and sharing it, or they're reading or making comment on this week's reading or a video, or just don't put in a forum and just leave it blank. You need to set up, this is what I want you to do, this is how I want you to respond, and, I'd like you to respond to 2 other students or 3 other students, or whatever it is that you want them to do, so that connectivity keeps rolling around. And you need to have that kind of stuff happening every week or 2. Especially if you're relying on the more you rely on asynchronous, the more you need to have that kind of thing bubbling along. If you've got a lot of, if you have weekly synchronous sessions, which many courses do, then the asynchronous stuff kind of fades slightly into the background. Having said that, the whole reason lots of people study online in the first place is to fit their study around their lifestyle, so their family responsibilities or their job or whatever the other thing is happening in their life. And for a lot of people, that other things that are happening in their life have changed over the last few months. So accessibility when you've got your online tutorials might not quite be the same. David, I do love a provocative question statement or use of statistics in ways that might be confronting to some people. The more provocative it is, the more likely you will get more people involved in discussion. But I wouldn't start with that. I would make sure that you built your community and your trust and relationship before you move into that type of space. Any other questions?
We also had a question about what are your views on integrating social media for that building, I'm assuming for that building of community.
So some learning management systems actually have the ability for that to be seamless, which is very lovely. Other people, I don't personally use social media with my undergrad students in particular, because I have a Twitter account, which is a work-based account, which is more likely to be with peers. I have a Facebook account, which is I do dual purpose in that I have family stuff. I do put some work stuff on there, and there are lots and lots of Facebook community groups. So there is an Australian higher education collective Facebook group, and send me an email if you want the link and I'll send it out. Because I work in teacher education, I'm also belong to a number of teacher Facebook groups. Lots of professional associations have their own Facebook groups as well. So there are a lot of different ways that you might bring people in. I know in America it is really common for you to have a tag that all of your students will follow, and that creates community in their space. That's not personally how I use it, however. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that that's not been what I do. Anything else?
Yes, Peter has actually asked, in terms of the type of assessment, formative versus summative, what impact does that have on building relationships and community?
So some disciplines are very happy for students to share drafts and get peer feedback, whereas other disciplines that would be totally inappropriate, particularly where there's only one answer, versus in the humanities and social sciences, which usually there's a broader range of responses that are applicable. And some students do or don't like to share, just like they don't like to put their cameras on sometimes. I've also found that when you're recording the session, lots of people don't like to ask the question when it's being recorded, but once you stop that recording button, there's lots and lots of questions afterwards. So that's really a very individual approach. There's no kind of common way, irrespective of discipline, that students actually deal with those things. I'm not sure if I answered the question though. David?
Peter, did that address your question?
Oh yes, thanks very much. Yes, I particularly work in the area of law, and the students are very competitive and they don't want to share their answers online. But part of me says that if the assessment was formative, there'd be more team building because they'd learn the content, then be assessed on it, rather than having a 100% exam at the end of the year.
Yep. And the other thing is you've probably already got activities built into even your face-to-face classes where they talk to each other about X, or in your case, a case. What are the 3 things that you need to consider, blah, blah, blah. So they would do that in small groups in your face-to-face class. So you can transfer that and put them into small groups online, both synchronously and asynchronously, depending, of course, on your learning management system. Yeah. And I would suggest that you do some of those things. So, even things like practice responses or whatever, you can use that kind of approach. And to be frank, at most universities, whether you like it or not, your students have already created a Facebook page, which is a back channel for them to communicate with each other. In the old days, they used to go to the refect or the pub or the coffee shop and they would talk about the course, whether that's a good talk, a bad talk, or other. And now they're just doing those in digital ways. Anything else? Any other comments or questions about what I've said today?
We just had one other one, is how do we ensure the connection between synchronous and asynchronous learning online? And I think this, if I'm interpreting Robin's question correctly, particularly as we move into what could be a very blended approach in this next session where we have some students on campus and some students off campus, how can you sort of facilitate community building in that mode of learning?
My experience, personally, I actually plan and teach very differently if it's only online than I do if it's face-to-face, than I do if it's blended. And the blended is the most difficult. And it's difficult in two ways. It can be difficult even if you have the same people who are on campus sometimes and online the rest, or in the case for most of us this semester coming up and maybe future semesters, some students will be on campus and some students won't be. And it is difficult. In a lot of the STEM areas, they actually replicate what they do face-to-face online as close as they possibly can. So they kind of feel like everybody is getting the same or a similar experience. But the reality is it's never the same because, you know, who's available and who's not available. And so I'm saying it is tough that the hybrid where you have some people online and some people face-to-face, it's actually one of the toughest approaches. It's much easier to have everyone online or everyone face-to-face. So for a lot of people, this is going to be quite a challenging semester in that space.
Can I just, this is Robin here, can I just clarify? Thanks for that response, Petrea. I actually meant when you've got all your students online, but you've got some of your learning coming through the learning management system asynchronously, and you've got some of your learning coming through a webinar or a Zoom session or whatever.
So try and decide what is easiest to deal with asynchronously. I know some people try and replicate even asynchronous and synchronous, but I haven't found that particularly useful for myself or my students in the past. So that's not something that I would recommend. So in terms of what happens asynchronously, I usually think about what are items that I want them to really critically think and reflect on? What are things that if they have time to have a considered response, that will be a better outcome for them and the students around them? And what types of activities, questions, information might I provide where I get a reaction which is off the hip or off the lips, some people call it, where it's instantaneous, it's immediate, you can't take it back, it's out there, but that's okay. In terms of a risk factor, it's not a big issue. So that may be two ways to think about it, Robin.
Yeah, thanks. It's the connection that I have trouble with. So yes, I can understand making the rationale between what you would do synchronously and what you would do asynchronously. It's how to have that as a sort of a connected approach. So the students, if you want students to do something asynchronously and then you want them to talk about it in the synchronous environment, how do you ensure that happens?
You've probably already learnt that just because it's synchronous doesn't mean everybody turns up. So if it's essential, that's the other thing I wouldn't put in a synchronous session, unless of course you are recording and making that available for your other students, because any essential information should be available for everybody. And because I'm looking after my 85-year-old mother who can't go out and do the shopping, and I'm doing that when the tutorial or the synchronous session is on, I shouldn't actually be disadvantaged in that space. I tend to use my discipline knowledge as a way for me to decide what's going where, actually. Okay, we right to move on?
I think we're good to go.
Great. So one of the issues about connectedness is there are so many different things that we like our students to be connected to and with. And the first one, of course, is the content. and while we are currently physically distancing ourselves from our students, whether that be online or face-to-face, it is essential that we have opportunities for connectedness. Again, it's about that relationship. So how do you meaningfully connect with your students from a social and cognitive perspective? So Garrison, Anderson and Archer developed a community of inquiry model, and it started off in higher ed and is now in online and has been used in higher ed in blended modes, and also starting to get used in K-12 and vocational education and other modes, work integrated learning, that kind of stuff. So the extent to which students can construct meaning through your conversations, that's the student to content stuff, but also student to student and student to peer. So how do you provide opportunities for reflective thinking, for critical thinking? How do they process the dialogue, whether that be text-based dialogue or verbal? And how do they mentally come to know stuff? And think about metacognition and how do I connect between what I already knew before and what's new information that's actually getting provided to me through the lectures or tutorials or whatever information it is that you're providing. And students, the idea here is that students do not, you as the instructor are not the only one who is helping them connect ideas. They're doing that independently, they're doing that collectively, and they're applying new ideas either in real or virtual environments, and that could just be they're testing it with their peers to see what they think. Under the community of inquiry, teaching presence is thought to be the glue that kind of holds the whole community together. So that's you, but it's not just you, it also can be your students, because it's not called teacher presence, it's actually called teaching presence. And you will design and organise the curriculum. You'll set the curriculum, you'll decide on the assessment. That's your job. Some of the direct instruction will be provided by all of the members in the community, because students will come up with other resources and other they will share things that they've found useful. Because I was talking to one lot of students and they had said to me, from a STEM space actually, and they had said, well, when I don't understand what my instructor says, I just go either on YouTube or Google, and I find another way of that being explained. And if it works for me, I think it might work for somebody else, so I share it. And that's one of the beauties of the digital world that we right now have. And your job, I think, is to anticipate what's coming, to plan for that, to prepare, to reflect on what's happened and repeat. And you kind of have mini cycles during the semester to do that, and then you have between semesters to do that. And I think in terms of connectedness, as in students connecting with content, with each other and with the teaching team, it's really important for you also to stay connected with your peers. I'm not sure as instructors how much you're missing, the morning coffee together or the chat over the water cooler or the incidental bumping in the hallways and those sort of conversations that you had. And I would really suggest that you do remember to check in with your colleagues regularly. So consider having weekly or fortnightly virtual coffee or morning tea in your team, or Friday afternoon drinks or midweek drinks, whatever, in ways that you would have previously connected. Just do that virtually as well. I have found that synchronous works for most people much better to get a real check-in, but asynchronous is better than no check-in at all. Any kind of comments or questions there?
Doesn't look like we have any. Petrea?
Okay, thanks. I'll move on.
Yeah.
I also want to talk briefly about beyond course connectedness, because particularly those of you who come from very large and established face-to-face universities, you want your students to be connected to your university in ways that they used to. So open days, career days, social, what sort of social clubs do you have? What sort of social events are there? So there are a few things that you can kind of do in that space. So our university for many years has had virtual career days and virtual open days, and we've ramped it up significantly this year, obviously, though. We even have open virtual orientation. Sometimes that's held at night because anybody who's working full-time then can participate. We have like conversations on the couch in a media room where we have TV cameras that might go for a number of different people that will chat about what their role in their course is, or not just their course but their program is. The head of school might do an intro, they might throw over to the work integrated learning coordinator or the program coordinator, or trying to even create that relationship and at least knowledge of who are the people that they can go to if they need help. That's still really important, so trying to make that visible is what most universities are trying to do. In particular now, I think work integrated learning or service learning is really useful now, where you can partner with either community-based organisations or small businesses. For example, if I was teaching social working, why not connect with some aged care facilities and actually have your students go in and do some work in that space, because it's largely one-on-one, and they'll be able to social distance. You know, if I was looking at psych, why not hook into some early childhood centres or some hospitals? Schools often obviously connect in with schools, but if I was looking at mental health, the allied health are another place that you can hook in to. If I was teaching business, whether that be things like accounting or something like that, maybe, or media, maybe I'm looking at how can I help a small business move their business online so they can collect online sales in a safe and secure manner, or how can I use social media to promote my business, or if I'm teaching IT, how do I help, how might students help a business actually develop a web presence? So that's all happening. So I think those sort of things are seen as really cool outcomes, both from a student learning perspective and from a community perspective. The other thing, particularly for those courses, and the government would suggest they've already identified which ones they are based on what happened last week, but those programs or courses that are used for entry into a profession, any connection with industry such as professional networks and professional associations are interesting and key and reasonably easy to set up. So depending on what your discipline is, that whole engagement with the industry might be more or less critical, but you know, think that. And what I have really seen is a huge increase in the amount of professional networking from an education perspective, whether that's in voc ed, higher ed, K-12 or early childhood. This has created much more sharing and much less, you know, I created this so it's all my work so I'm not going to tell anybody about it type of approach. I'll just stop there and see if there's any comments.
Actually, I wanted to make a comment on this, Petrea, because I'm glad you, particularly the student industry connection. I have to say one of the most valuable things in my training over the years, both in my master's and my PhD, is we had those opportunities in a forum like this, where they actually brought in experts or industry folks in our field. And it was an opportunity for us not only to run the session, but to do things like interview them and to really understand the state of the field and the different perspectives in the field. So it was one thing to get the discipline knowledge in the classroom, but it was really of value to have that interaction with people who were already out in the field and how that may vary from the theory to the actual practice. And I found that to be very useful, particularly coming into, at the time it was going to be training and development before I got into learning design at the university.
And I've done something similar. I used to run a females in STEM network, and one of the most useful things that the participants all said, and whether they were high school students or university students or people who just started out in the industry, was to talk to people who have been in the industry for a long time about their experiences as female, you know, or a minority in the their profession. So I would concur that that is, you know, it's very useful. Other comments or questions?
Does anybody have any final questions for Petrea before we finish up? We've got about 15 minutes. So it's open slather. If you have questions about community building or learning and teaching online, I'm sure Petrea would be happy to answer those.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's Vicky again. I just wanted to ask about one of your earlier comments about relating to the digital divide, and what's your experience with, like, I guess it's the level of readiness for both students and teaching teams, and what strategies you've used there.
That divide is greater or smaller for every single person. So, you know, the whole one-size-fits-all thing isn't happening. But what sort of support, having support and just-in-time support is really important. Most, at least in our situation, most students, not all, but most have access to a personal device that's digital. Now, it might be a phone, it might be an iPad, it could be a laptop, or it could be a standalone computer. Or some of them might be sharing those laptop and standalone computers with other members of their either family or whoever they live with, or what have you. So thinking about that is really key to what are the assumptions that you have made in terms of what access people have. Some universities, and most of them have ramped this up in the last few months, in that the IT support for students and staff has been significantly more, and it's easier to get that support perhaps than it was previously. In some universities, even there's been an extension of how long those people are available. A lot of those people now are working online themselves, so they're not sitting in an office with others. And so connecting in with what already exists is a good one. But if you're an instructor, connecting with your professional associations and your peers, whether they be at your university or other universities, is a great way to keep things happening. I just noticed that question came up, and it was about issues with Zoom, and I only saw the first part of the question. A lot of students who don't have robust internet connections, so they either don't have it at home because they're just used to using their mobile phone, just like they don't have a home phone number at home anymore, they just have their mobile. I have seen and read of people, you know, driving and sitting in their car outside of schools and universities and libraries to use their internet access because it's more robust than the access they actually have in their homes. So that is something to consider. In terms of the Zoom link, in terms of the robust and internet, my first thing is always turn off your camera, you know, if we're having trouble where things are lagging or not. Encouraging the use of chat, because not all of our students have a place to listen and contribute to synchronous items where it's quiet. So some of them, it's the ambient noise around them means they don't want their audio on because it's quite intrusive to everybody around them. My husband and I are working at home. You can probably see his computer at the moment. When we are working at the same time and we have, you know, synchronous sessions like this, one of us has to move to another room. So there are some inconveniences happening. Now, I didn't read the rest of that question, so I don't know if I've answered it. David, I just saw it flick across and it kind of grabbed my attention.
That's okay. Could you share insights for overcoming the challenges of Zoom for activities? For example, does it help to allocate duties to students to give them ownership and rotate the duties each class? For example, monitoring the chat, asking questions, moderator, fact checker, timekeeper, etc.
Yep, that's definitely a more efficient and effective way to go, but it does make it a little more formal in some cases. I'm pretty big on using breakout rooms too, where they will self-manage as an independent group. You know, here you've got an activity to do, go away. And largely that works. However, having said that, we had a research day with some staff this last week before last, and you know, so we sent them off with activities to do, and even the staff came back and went, actually, we didn't do what you said, but we did have a good chat. So having some way of monitoring, and you as your teaching team popping in and out, that's useful. Some universities have an IT person who will enter into every synchronous session there is just to check on the technical issues. You know, so they will do the audio check and some of those things. So you as the instructor only need to concentrate on the curriculum and the pedagogical approach that's happening. The technology side of it is actually dealt with by an IT specialist. So if you're lucky enough to have that facility in your university and you have been having trouble with Zooms, I would grab that with two hands, or maybe it's even just, if you're friendly with the IT people, just giving them a tap on the shoulder and asking them to come and join you for the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes of your Zoom session, so that you can, you know, again, you don't have to be reliant on that. And often they will use some back channeling with the students. So if it's not working, they'll send private message and ask them for their phone number, or they'll send them a way to share their screen so that they can help troubleshoot that way. I'm not sure if that was useful.
Peter also
I
asked,
can see your question there. I have done that before and I love it. So it's almost like it's a content-free course. You have ideas, you know, you already know what the topics are going to be, etc. And your worst case scenario, you can put stuff in there yourself, but having students to share and create the content on the way works well. In my discipline, it works especially well because they're going to be teachers. So, you know, I'm trying to promote for them that they need to be able to teach each other and not just teach students at high school. So it does work particularly well for me. But I know that people in other, it doesn't just happen. Those content-free courses doesn't just happen in teacher education. They do actually happen in a range of spaces. And I think too, yep, Google, any shared document, any shared kind of writing space is useful in some of those areas. So if you use wikis or blogs where they can comment on each other's stuff, whether they're internal to your learning management system or external to it, you know, that can be useful. Right now, well, I love Google Docs. So when I'm collaboratively research writing with people, you know, that's how I use it. And I say to the students, well, you can use this too. You know, you don't have, if there's a group assignment that assists huge in version and control, which students often have issues with. There you go. Using a database tool in Moodle to share resources and ideas works as well from David's perspective. Any last comments or questions?
Peter just posted another one. What can we do to get international students to contribute with domestic students without making them uncomfortable by putting them on the spot?
So there's a couple of things to do that. And before, when I think it was Robin was talking about what to put asynchronously and what to put synchronously, international students, particularly those for whom English is a second language, they much prefer the asynchronous, to contribute asynchronously rather than synchronously, because they don't feel like they're being put on the spot. That can be overcome by you actually pre-releasing the questions or the comments or the activities that you want them to do synchronously, so they can actually think about that and have some sort of pre-preparation in that space. That kind of reduces the risk factor for them, in that they've got something pre-prepared and they don't feel like they've been put on the spot. So they're two ideas.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Okay. I love Padlet also. It's very easy, it's very visual, and for most people, because it can be used on lots of different devices, it usually works for most people, and it's reasonably intuitive. I have never found that you have to spend a lot of time talking people through how it works. So that's another device, another resource that, again, would be in most cases outside of your learning management system, but it does work well. And you can use it both synchronously and asynchronously, actually. Okay, Deb, thanks very much for coming. And I suspect that you're not the only one who's heads off, so I'll just put some final comments in. There's my email address if you've got some more, any other questions or comments, and that's my Twitter account I handle if you want to follow me. I kind of want to finish with, I'd like to really remind you that you need to show your passion for your discipline when you're online. You need to be passionate about your discipline, but you also need to be compassionate about your students. That's a really big thing, particularly when we're in the world that we're in right now. The second thing I'd like to comment on is, please be forgiving of yourself and of your peers, because we've been asked to accomplish a lot in a really short period of time, and mistakes have and will be made. So just be compassionate to your peers as well. And the last one is, you've got this. You have got this. You know what you're doing now. You've had a go at it. And yeah, there's going to be bumps and ripples along the road, but it's going to be okay. Thanks, everybody, for your time today.
Thank you very much, Petrea. And on behalf of ASCILITE, we want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We hope that you found the information useful and that we will keep you informed of other webinars. You will find the details on our website. And so we'll have another webinar coming up in about a month's time. So please stay tuned for that. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.